right, my friends, it is now time for the Soulful Psalms segment of Beacon of Truth. The Soulful Psalms, you take one of the Psalms from the book of sung praises, the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. We connect that Psalm to the daily Mass readings. Well, today is Friday of the fourth week of Lent, and we have Psalm 34 today. So Psalm 34 is, of course, in book one of the Psalms. All the Psalms 1 through 41, are written by David. And so let's take a look at the readings that surround Psalm 34 today. The first reading is from the book of Wisdom. And you're going to notice a pattern if you're going to daily Mass, or if you are looking at the readings or reflecting on the readings every day. You know, as we get closer and closer to Holy Week, we're going to see the readings become a little more ominous. You know, they're going to be pointing more toward the persecution and death of Jesus. You know, and so we see that very clearly here in the first reading from the book of Wisdom. Again, this is one of these readings that if you look at it allegorically, again, as you look at it, how the Old Testament points toward Jesus and reveals Jesus in the New Testament, because all the scriptures point toward our Lord. You know, we see that here in the book of Wisdom, and it also imparts tremendous wisdom for us. So this is very interesting. It says, the wicked said among themselves. So again, think of yourself living in the culture, in a culture that's broken, that's confused, that's hurting, and in a lot of ways that's lost. And that's why we have to be a people of the Eucharist, you know, fed, nurtured, and empowered by Jesus Christ in word and in sacrament, and the holy sacrifice of the Mass, which strengthens and nurtures the spirit that we received in baptism and confirmation. We are impelled to go forth to witness to the power of Christ's love to the world, to be a people of the Eucharist. And so when we're going to encounter people that think like the people here in the book of Wisdom. So it says, the wicked among themselves say, let us beset the just one, because he is obnoxious to us. So the book of Wisdom here, Solomon is talking about, here is the thinking of the people of the world. You know, and St. Paul talks about putting on the mind of Christ. So these are people who don't think like Christ, who don't act like Christ, who eschew religious freedom and tolerance, right? So he said, let us beset the just one, because he is obnoxious to us. He sets himself against our doings, right? Reproaches us for transgressions of the law and charges us with violation of training. He professes to have knowledge of God, styles himself as a child of the Lord. To us, he is the censure of our thoughts. Merely to see him is a hardship for us. So there's setting up a very strong parallel here between people who choose to follow God and his law and people who choose to follow their own law, who set themselves up against the law of God. Again, we see this as an extension of what happened in the book of Genesis. You remember the lie of Satan, you will be like God. You don't need God. You're your own God. Right? And so now the evil person, the unjust person, is setting himself up against the person who is just and following the law. Even to look at him is obnoxious to us. You know, we don't want to hear anything that this person has to say. And that's what's happening in our culture. The culture of deplatforming, the culture of trying to take our voice away, won't let us, doesn't want to hear anything that a person of faith has to say. You know, and so the person in the culture is trying to call us out, you know, and trying to demean us simply because we stand up and defend the truth and beauty of our faith. You know, and so it says, with revilement and torture, let us put him to the test. So now it's just not a matter of people of faith being obnoxious and being boisterous. It says now we want to torture them and put them to the test. You know, let us condemn him to a shameful death. Now we see how it's pointing toward Jesus here. So, of course, the Pharisees and the scribes did not like Jesus' teaching, primarily because he said he was God. In the famous quote in John's gospel, he says, "Before Abraham was, I am." So Jesus calls himself the name that was revealed to Moses in the burning bush. The first time that God ever reveals his name is in that burning bush. And he says, he calls himself the I am, the Ayer Asher, or Yahweh, with the unpronounceable name of God. And Jesus calls himself that, and that's eventually what got him condemned and killed, referring to himself as God. So in wisdom here, it says, let us condemn him to a shameful death. It says, for according to his own words, God will take care of him. What does that sound like to you? The devil in Matthew chapter 4 and Luke chapter 4, the temptation of Jesus in the desert, where he says, throw yourself down here from the parapet of the temple. And the devil quotes Psalm 91 to Jesus. The angels will catch you lest you strike your foot against the stone. And again, to me, analogous here to the book of wisdom, where the evil is saying, God will protect him. We condemn to death. He says God will protect him. Then he has nothing to worry about. Ooh, again, very much pointing toward Jesus here in the book of wisdom. And the gospel is from John's gospel, chapter 7. So Jesus moved about within Galilee, but he didn't travel to Judea because he said the Jews were trying to kill him, right? So Jesus already knows that they're plotting to kill him, but he's not done with the work of the Father yet. So he's trying to avoid going to Judea where he knows that ultimately he's going to be condemned to death. But he still has to do the Father's work. And so he's avoiding that area for now. So again, a nice tie-in and parallel with the book of wisdom. And he says the Feast of Tabernacle was near. So remember, Jesus was a faithful Jew, and he would go to Jerusalem for one of the three major feasts: the Feast of Passover, or unleavened bread, the Pesach, the Feast of Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks, which was the wheat harvest. In Hebrew, that's the Shavuot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, that's being referred here in John's Gospel, the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, which was the fruit harvest, or the Sukkot in Hebrew. So they were, the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles was drawing near, and he said his brothers had gone up to Jerusalem for the feast. Because remember, no matter what direction you're traveling to Jerusalem from, you always go up to Jerusalem, right? You always go up to Jerusalem. And interestingly, when you're going up to Jerusalem for one of these three major feasts, you would always sing the songs of ascents, or the gradual psalms, Psalms 120 to 134. Those psalms were sung by worshipers as they ascended the road to Jerusalem to celebrate one of these three feasts. So some of the inhabitants of Jerusalem were saying, is he not the one they're trying to kill? So they're talking about Jesus here. And he is speaking openly, and they say nothing to him. Why? Because the authorities, even though they wanted to kill Jesus, they were afraid of the pushback from the people, because they liked what Jesus was saying. Why? Because they recognized truth, that the Lord was speaking truth to them. And so they were afraid of being chastised by the people for condemning the teachings of Jesus. And so they were a little bit hesitant to move against Jesus right away, especially during one of these major feasts. And he says the authorities said, could the authorities have realized that he is the Christ? And they said, well, no, because we don't know where he is from. And Psalm 34 talks about the Lord is close to the brokenhearted. So even when we feel dejected by people who attack us, it's like St. Athanasius, we should feel confidence in God's love.
For more on the Psalms with Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers, check out Beacon of Truth weekdays at 4 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio and streaming everywhere you listen to podcasts.